Hello everybody, welcome to Eddie's Korean class. Now these days, that many foreigners are usually become very popular with the Korea's K-pop. And also the most important point is that in United States, I heard that they usually have the big short histories for about the 300 years. But according to South Korea, generally we do have histories about more than 5,000 years. So whenever we try to communicate with the foreign languages, I think that it'll be a good chance to understand with the Korean language. Hi, my name is Eddie Kim. So I'm at first before really trying to go for the classes, so I'm going to tell you my profiles so that you can able to understand. Okay, this will be my profiles that you could able to understand. So, I was graduated at the Kyunghee University. Kyunghee University is located in Seoul. That my major was the English Korean Interpretation and Translation, and I'm studying for the graduate schools of the Korea University and Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. These are my majors that I'm trying to study right now. And also, I'm from South Korea, but I used to live in many foreign experiences. Like I used to stay in the United States about almost 4 years and 3 months, for India for 2.5 years, and Malaysia for about the 1 year and 2 months. Okay, so today, we're going to discuss about the history of the Korean languages, so that the many people try to understand about how does the Korean language try to make. Before when you have a discussion, it's very important to understand the many different kinds of other languages like English or Chinese or Vietnamese or Spanish or any other countries. Actually, now these days, I'm very interested to understand about the history of the Korean languages. But basically, if you try to understand about the history of Japan, actually, there's not much of histories about who tried to invent the history of the Japanese. But if you try to understand about the history of Korean languages, if you're very interested about the countries of South Korea, then I'm surely that you could able to see the Korean money note, which is about 10,000 won. When you try to look at the 10,000 won, you could see the man's face for the 10,000 won. His name was King Sejong. King Sejong was the only person that he tried to create the Korean alphabet. Now, basically, according to the English language could be started from A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. But I could say that according to the English language, basically in English alphabet, it's very easy to understand. It's because all we need to do is then we could try to understand about the words from A to Z. But Korean, I could say that if many foreigners are from Thailand, then I'm really sure that the word of Thai language is very similar with the Korean language. It is because when you try to understand about the history of the Korean languages, the words like 기억, 니은, 니은, 디귿, 리을, 미음, 비읍, 시읒, and so on. And also when does these one alphabets and other alphabets are trying to combine each other, then we could include as a word as ka, na, ta, ra. But it's the first class, so that I'm going to tell you about more details about how to pronounce of the Korean languages in the next lecture. So basically, if we try to understand about the King Sejong, he used to create about the Korean alphabet. Excuse me. So at first, when many of the Korean people tried to got about the Korean languages, many Korean people think that they feel very had a hard time to understand about the Korean languages. So King Sejong was really considered about what to do about this situation. So he made a decision to borrow from Chinese word and try to make and change it as a Chinese word to as a Korean word. So if there's any student from Chinese, then I'm surely that the language of Chinese is a very easy to learn from Korean, because some of the words which is compared with the Korean and Chinese, I'm surely that the languages try to become similar. For example, in English, we do have a word called marriage. In Korean word, we try to say as 결혼 or 혼인, and I heard that in Chinese, the word is very similar with 혼인. They say like 헌인 or something like that. And also there is a word called remarry, which is called in Korean word we try to say as 재혼. But I heard that according to the Chinese language of 재혼 is very similar, so they try to describe as 자이혼. If there's any student from Vietnamese student, I could surely that the word of Vietnamese is also similar as Chinese and Korean. It's because whenever we try to understand what the word as the, for example, like 결혼 or marriage or 이혼 or jaihon, the word is very similar with the Chinese and Vietnamese and Korean. So so after that, so when you're trying to understand about the Korean languages, I'm surely that it's very comfortable to understand, especially from the student from Chinese and Korean, Chinese and the Vietnamese or any other Asian countries. Well, let's try to go for next page. So this time I'm not trying to go for the really the hard time for this class because if my classes try to be more strict then I'm surely that many other Korean students found really difficult and try to get really bored about the language classes. But don't worry, I'm here to help you to understand about the Korean languages. So now this time we are going to understand about the differences between the Korean languages that which uses in North and South Korea. Basically, if we try to understand about the Korean languages, actually the countries of the North Korea and South Korea has been divided after the Korean War since 1953, July 27th. At that time, there was a ceasefire between these two countries. During the Korean War, there was a crisis between the South Korea and North Korea at the time. At the time, North Korea tried to invade the country of South Korea around 3 a.m. So at that time, many Korean people are going on a vacation or something like that. So when after that, they made a decision to fight against with North Korea. So I could say that some of the words between the North and South Korean languages are a little bit different with it. Let's try to give example. So when you try to understand about the South Korean languages, so we usually call this form as a borrowed English. For example, now in Korean word, we do have a word called hamburger. In Korean word, we also try to say as hamburger. And also, if you try to understand about the word as cola, cola is also same as cola. And also, if you try to pronounce as a word as spaghetti, then we try to describe as spaghetti. So the word of hamburger, cola, and spaghetti, these three words that usually came from the word of English. So there will be no problem to communicate with these language with the English speaking speakers. But if you try to understand about the Korean word that which uses in North Korea, I could say the word of North Korea borrowed from the word from Russian. It is because actually when you try to, it's very important to understand about the history of Russian, but actually the country of Russia becomes as a Soviet Union before, but it was one of the communist country in around the world. But since 1990, that the Soviet Union has been collapsed and the country becomes a Russian. So during the Korean War, actually the country North Korea tried to be more friends with Russia and China, and also when you try to look at the diplomat histories between the United States and South Korea, I could say that they're allies and friends. So does with North Korea and Russia and Chinese. So sometimes they try to exchange many different kinds of languages. So that's why some of the word came from Russian. For example, there is a word called minus. Minus, the word of minus came from the word of Russian, but I heard that in North Korea they tried to say as minus, but in Korea it's quite different. Okay, so everyone, let's try to repeat the word which is uses differences between the North and South Korea. Minus. Minus is a part of the word that which uses in North Korea, but how do we try to pronounce the word in South Korea? We usually say as minus, just as a pronunciation which is same as English. Okay, let's try to give an example with the word as blues. The word of blues came from the word as Russian. But if we try to say as the blues, which means plus in English, if we try to pronounce as a plus in Korean, then you usually try to pronounce as plus, plus. And also, I could able to give many other examples with the word as the word differences between North and South Korea, but let's try to give example. There is a word called 꽃제비. The 꽃제비 is a very unpopular word that which uses in North Korea, but actually the word of the 꽃제비 came from the word of Russian. So when you try to understand about the word as a 꽃제비, as you know, basically, if you try to understand about the countries of the North Korea, many North Korean people are starving after the communist country has been came up since 1948. Many North Korean people are trying to have starving right now. They don't have any food, they don't have any money to eat or something. So when you try to understand what the word as a "utaebi," in English we usually describe as beggar. Beggar means that a person tries to borrow food, asking for food to other people that we could describe as a word as a "utaebi." So, as you can see, when you try to understand about the word differences between Korean language between North and South Korea, the word of South Korea, some of the words that it borrows from the English, but if you try to understand about the word of North Korea, the word of North Korea usually borrow from the word from Russian. Okay, let's try to go for next page and try to give another example of the word as the word differences between North and South Korea. So interestingly, if we try to understand about the PowerPoint and the information, you could see that some of the North Korean word are trying to prove from the meaning. Um, let's try to give example. In North Korean word, there is a word called 고기 겹방. Actually, when you try to look at the histories between the North Korea and United States, they don't try to untrust and they don't try to believe the English language. So sometimes many North Korean people they try to they try to prove as the meaning of the hamburger. Okay, basically, if you try to understand about the meaning as a hamburger, hamburger means that it's kind of a junk food that we try to cover the beef and bread and lettuce. But if we try to understand about the word as a hamburger in North Korea, then we usually say as 고기 겹방. Now, the most important point is why do we have to say as a 고기 겹방 as a hamburger? It's because you can imagine from the word meaning of hamburger. Now, when you try to think of the hamburger, you could think as the meat and bread. According to the word of meat in Korean word, we usually try to say as 고기. And also there is a word called pile, which is called 겹. Actually, the word of 겹, it usually came from the word as piling, and also bang means bread. So the word of the 고기 겹방, it usually described as hamburger. And also, let's try to go for another examples with the word of North Korean word. In North Korean word, we usually have a word called 단물. Tan is a part of the adjective in Korean. We usually say as tan means sweet and 물 means water. So that's why we try to say as tan물 as a North Korean word. We usually say as cider. As you know, when you try to drink as a soft drinks, the soft drink water is very sweet. So that's why they try to prove the meaning, and the word becomes as tan물. Alright, let's try to go for the next page so that you can able to understand. And also, when you try to understand about the word differences between the North and South Korean word, Basically, if you try to understand as a the generally in this the Korean word, we usually have a pronunciation with the word as ing, but if you try to pronounce the word as ing, we usually read as pronounce as uh. Alright, let's try to give as the example word of 여자. The word of 여자, it means it usually described as women. But if we try to describe as 여성, 여성 could be described as a female. Now, when you try to understand about the word as the Korean language that which uses in the South Korea, we do have a pronunciations that we usually include the word as in, but according to the word in North Korea, they don't have a proper word that which tries to describe as in. Instead of with using 여자, a North Korean word they usually try to say as 녀자. The word of 녀자, it usually came from the pronunciation with n, which is described as nian. And also, if we try to change as 여성 as a North Korean word, then we try to say as 녀성, 녀성. So if we try to understand the word differences between the North Korean and South Korean word, that they don't have a pronunciation with the ian, but instead of that, they usually have a pronunciation with a word as ian. Alright, let's try to go for next page. Alright, these are the Korean alphabets that we try to understand. Basically, if you try to understand about the Korean alphabets, I'll try to help you how to read it, and I'll tell you how to pronounce the word one by one. Okay, let's try to repeat everyone. 기억, 기억. 니은, 니은. 디귿, 디귿. 리을, 리을. 미음, 미음. 비읍, 비읍. 시읒, 시읒. 이응, 이응. 지읒, 지읒. 치읒, 치읒. 키읔, 키읔. 디귿, 디귿. 피읍, 피읍. 히읗, 히읗. Alright, now I just tried to make as a how to read about the Korean alphabet. So, how do you feel about the Korean alphabet? Don't you feel that this kind of word is very interesting to understand? Okay, this time I'm going to help you to how to pronounce the word of Korean alphabet, which starts from the word as 기억히응. Or let's start to repeat one by one. G, G, N, N. D, D, R, R, M, M, B, B, S, S, J, J, Ch, Ch, K, K, T, T, P. Alright, so when you try to understand about the pronunciation with the Korean alphabet, okay, let's try to understand about the word of the ki역. Now, the word of ki역, the pronunciation with the word of ki역, it sounds like a G, the English alphabet of G sound. So we try to pronounce as a similar word of G, G. And also the next word that there is a word called the nian. So it's very important to understand about the word of nian. Now, how do you pronounce the word as nian? The sound of nian, it usually same as n, n. The word of that English, it's the pronunciation is very similar with the word as n, the mn. The sounds is it's just similar with the word of sounds with n. So that's why we try to say as n, n. And also, when you try to pronounce the word as ticket, we usually say as d, d. So if you try to understand about the word of alphabet as ticket, the word of ticket, it usually it is very similar with the word as the alphabet of D, D. So basically, if you try to pronounce the word as D, we usually say as d, d. And also, let's try to go for the word as year. Generally the word of year, it usually pronounced as a word as r, r. So the word of year, the pronunciation is really similar with the word as r. If we try to pronounce the word as r, so we usually read as years. For example, if we try to pronounce as a word as robot in English, then Korean word is also same. So we usually try to pronounce as a word as rear. Okay, let's try to go for the next word. M, m. So if we try to pronounce as a word as mium, the pronunciation of mium is just similar as m, with the word of sound like the m sound, like mommy, mother, a mustard. The word pronunciation is just similar with the word as m, m. And also there is a word called pew. So if you try to pronounce the word as the pronunciation, it usually sounds like alphabet B, like burger, beast, bully. The word of the pew is really similar as b. And also the word of that this shield. The shield is just the pronunciation is very similar with s, s, with the word as s. And also there is a word called ing. Actually, the pronunciation of ing is quite a little bit difficult to understand how it describes, but when you try to understand about the word as pronouncing the word as ing, we usually try to say as uh, uh, uh. And also, if you try to describe as a word as jit, we usually pronounce as a word as j, j. So the word of jit, the sound of jit is a very similar with the word as j. And also, it's very important to understand about the word as jit, ch. The word of ch, the jit, the pronunciation is just similar with the word as ch, like bench, watch. The word is very similar with the word as ch. Alright, so if we try to pronounce the word as kill, the pronunciation word of kill is usually similar with the word as k, like k. And also if we try to pronounce the word as ticket, ticket sounds like t with the word as t. And also if you try to pronounce the word as p, P, it sounds like the alphabet P, which is just like popcorn or something like that. And also word of heel, the heel usually pronounced as a word as H, like or something like that. Alright, let's try to go for next page. So next page, we're going to describe how to pronounce the word as the word of aya, oyo, uyo, uyu, ui. Okay, let's try to pronounce the word one by one. Ah, ah, ya, ya, o, yo, yo, o, yo, yo, ooh, ooh, you, uh, uh, e. Okay, so if you try to understand about the word as the word starts from A to E, how do you find about this pronunciation? Well, some of the words are very that similar with the word as the English word, right? Okay, so we're going to end of the class for today. So if you have any questions about me, you can able to send me as munjain0827@gmail.com, or you can contact me by a KakaoTalk ID. My KakaoTalk ID is Korea0827. Okay, next class, I'm going to teach you about how to pronounce the word of one and another, so that the word of g and a, it becomes a word as ka. Okay, so next time I'm going to teach you about more pronunciation about the Korean languages. Okay, I will see you next Saturday. Thank you very much.
아까 그건 좀 그런 느낌이 이상해.
중간에 그 얘기하면 어떻게 해?
아니.